Dean Martin. The name alone brings back a flood of golden-era Hollywood memories. The velvet voice, the effortless charm, the tuxedoed silhouette under stage lights, and that trademark smile that seemed to make the whole world feel lighter. But behind the smooth crooner image, behind the Rat Pack glamour and the endless laughter, was a man carrying a lifetime of heartbreak, and the most devastating pieces of his story revolve around the woman who once held his entire world together, his wife, Jean. People saw the fame. They saw the movies, the comedy routines, the Vegas lights, and the roar of adoring crowds. But very few ever saw the truth. The love story between Dean Martin and Jean didn't just fade. It shattered, and what followed in the years after their separation became one of the quietest, yet most tragic downfalls in Hollywood history. Fans always ask the same question: how could a man so adored, so successful, so iconic, end his life so painfully alone? And what really happened to Jean, the woman he never truly stopped loving? Many don't know that Dean spent his final years retreating from the world, drowning in grief, regret, and the ghosts of a past he couldn't change. And Jean's ending? Even more heartbreaking, a silent decline far away from the spotlight she never wanted. This is the real story, the quiet pain, the devastating loss, and the awful ending that Hollywood never showed you. This is what really happened to Dean Martin, and the woman who carried his heart until the day he died. Long before tragedy touched their lives, Dean Martin and Jean Beager were the picture-perfect couple Hollywood adored, but never fully understood. Their love story didn't explode onto tabloid covers. It unfolded quietly, almost gently. In a world where relationships were usually built on glitter and spotlight, Jean wasn't another actress chasing fame. She wasn't dazzled by celebrity or desperate for attention. She was soft-spoken, elegant, and genuine, everything Dean had spent years searching for in a world full of noise. When Dean met Jean in 1948, his life was already moving fast. He was half of the wildly successful comedy duo Martin and Lewis, one of the biggest acts in America. Fame was climbing, pressure was mounting, and his personal life was complicated. But Jean offered something no spotlight could give him: peace. She was calm where Hollywood was chaotic, warm where fame was cold. The two connected instantly, forming a bond deeper than either expected. They married in 1949, and for nearly 24 years, Jean became the quiet anchor of Dean's whirlwind life. When the cameras were rolling, Dean was the charismatic showman with the velvet voice. But at home, he was a devoted husband and father, happiest sitting around the dinner table, playing cards, or simply watching his children laugh. Jean created a life filled with normal moments, something Dean treasured more than anyone ever realized. As his career soared, from hit albums to blockbuster movies and Rat Pack fame, Jean remained his grounding force. She shielded him from the worst of Hollywood's pressures, offering a stable home when everything outside their door was unpredictable. To friends and family, they seemed unbreakable, a rare example of real love surviving Hollywood's toughest storms. But behind closed doors, the cracks slowly began to show. Dean's schedule became grueling, the demands of show business relentless. Late-night performances, constant travel, and an avalanche of expectations slowly eroded the peaceful life they had built. Jean watched the man she loved being swallowed by fame, and though she tried to hold everything together, the pressure was overwhelming. Still, their connection remained strong. Strong enough that every friend around them believed they would last forever. Their children adored them both, and Dean's happiest memories were always tied to Jean. Even after years of success, he would come home each night seeking the same comfort he felt the first time he met her. Yet something was changing. Dean was exhausted, pulled in too many directions, and struggling silently with his own demons, a truth he rarely shared with anyone, including Jean. The man who made America laugh was slowly losing his own joy. By the early 1970s, the cracks had become chasms. After nearly a quarter century together, the couple quietly ended their marriage in 1973. Not with scandal, not with bitterness, but with a heartbreaking sense of inevitability. And though they separated, everyone close to them knew one thing: Dean never stopped loving Jean. Not for a single day, their love story wasn't just another Hollywood romance. It was the cornerstone of Dean Martin's life, the anchor of his best years, the quiet refuge he would never find again. And when their marriage ended, it marked the beginning of a slow, emotional unraveling that would eventually haunt both of them. Until their final days, when Dean Martin and Jean parted ways in 1973, the world saw it as just another Hollywood divorce, to people going in different directions. But those who truly knew them understood the truth. The separation marked the beginning of a quiet unraveling that neither of them ever fully recovered from. Dean didn't talk about it publicly, but the people closest to him said that losing Jean was like losing his compass. She had been the calm in the middle of his storm, and without her, something inside him slowly dimmed. Professionally, Dean kept moving. He continued to sing, perform, and host the Dean Martin Show. But the spark that once made his performances effortless began to fade. Audiences still adored him, and the world kept laughing at his jokes, but behind the scenes, he was withdrawing. Friends noticed the change. He didn't socialize the same way, didn't laugh as freely, didn't seem as present. The man who once lit up every room now preferred dim corners, silence, and solitude. Meanwhile, Jean faced her own heartbreak. She had built her world around Dean and their children, believing their home life was the one part of Hollywood she could trust. The divorce shattered more than a marriage. It uprooted her emotional foundation. Jean was not a woman who thrived on fame or the spotlight. She was a private soul who wanted nothing more than a peaceful, loving home. Losing Dean was losing the future she had spent decades imagining. Despite the separation, Jean and Dean never became strangers. They remained connected through their children, birthdays, holidays, and the lingering affection neither could erase. Jean still spoke lovingly of him, and Dean still protected her privacy fiercely. He never allowed anyone to speak badly of her. But even though they stayed friendly, the emotional distance was real, and both of them carried an unspoken sadness that time couldn't heal. As the years passed, tragedy began to creep into Dean's life. The most devastating blow came in 1987, when his beloved son, Dean Paul Martin, died in a military jet crash. The loss broke him completely, and for the first time, the world saw Dean Martin not as the charismatic entertainer, but as a father shattered into pieces. Jean was equally devastated. Dean Paul had been her child too. The grief united them in sorrow, but the pain was too deep for either to truly recover. Dean's decline accelerated after the loss. He withdrew even further, performing less frequently, isolating himself, and eventually retreating almost entirely from public life. His friends said he stopped caring about fame, career, or legacy. The only thing he longed for was peace, something he once had when Jean was by his side, something he could no longer reach. Jean, too, lived a quieter life, focusing on her family, volunteering, and avoiding publicity. But the loneliness never left her. She carried a quiet sadness that those close to her could feel, but never fully understand. Her life had been built around loving a man who, despite all his brilliance, struggled to love himself the same way. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, both their lives had become shadows of what they once were. To people who had once shared a vibrant life now lived separately in grief, regret, and the haunting memories of better days. It was clear. Their divorce didn't mark the end of a marriage. It marked the beginning of a tragic decline that neither of them would ever truly escape. By the 1990s, Dean Martin was no longer the unstoppable entertainer who ruled Las Vegas, television screens, and concert halls. He had become a ghost of the man the world adored. The death of his son had fractured him, but the years of emotional exhaustion, loneliness, and regret that followed were what finally broke his spirit. Dean withdrew so deeply into himself that friends wondered if he was waiting for life to simply fade away. He stopped performing almost entirely. The man who once charmed millions preferred darkened rooms, soft music in the background, and long stretches of silence. His friends tried to bring him back into the world, Sinatra, Lewis, family members, but Dean had made up his mind. He was done with the spotlight, done with pretending he was okay, and done with forcing himself to smile when his heart was permanently bruised. He spent his days mostly alone in his Beverly Hills home, He would sit for hours looking out the window, sometimes smoking, sometimes sipping a drink, sometimes doing nothing but thinking. What did he think about? Those who knew him best say it always came back to two things: the son he lost, and the woman he never stopped loving. Jean felt the distance too. Even though they were no longer husband and wife, she heard stories about Dean's decline, his reclusiveness, his sadness, and although she respected his privacy, she carried a deep and private sorrow knowing how much pain he lived with. They had shared so much of their lives that even in separation, their emotions were still intertwined. Jean's own final years were quiet, almost hidden from the world. She spent time with her children, attended church, volunteered, and kept a low profile. But beneath her loving personality, there was an undeniable melancholy that never fully lifted after the divorce and the loss of her son. She had once been the core of a warm, bustling family life, a life that slowly dissolved as tragedy swept through it. Dean's health deteriorated rapidly. Heavy smoking had taken its toll. He struggled to breathe, struggled to move, and struggled to cope with the physical pain that now matched his emotional suffering. Yet he refused major treatments. He refused surgeries. He refused anything that would prolong a life he no longer felt connected to. His famous stubbornness was now desperation disguised as pride. In 1995, surrounded not by the roar of crowds, but by the quiet hum of medical machines, Dean Martin slipped away. No bright lights, no applause, just a man who had once lived larger than life now leaving the world in near silence. Hollywood mourned loudly. His family mourned quietly. Jean mourned in a way only she could, with dignity, heartbreak, and the knowledge that the man she loved had never fully healed after their story fell apart. She lived for 7 more years after Dean's passing, but she never remarried, never sought fame, and never stepped back into the spotlight. Jean died in 2001, softly, quietly, like a candle that slowly flickers out, and with her went the last living piece of the world she and Dean had built together. Their love story did not end with a scandal or a dramatic public breakup. It ended with 2 hearts bruised by time, tragedy, and choices neither could undo. And in their final years, they remained connected not by marriage, but by the silent grief that only they could understand. When people talk about Dean Martin, they remember the voice, the swagger, the grin that could melt an entire room. They remember the Rat Pack, the tuxedo, the martini glass, the effortless cool that made him one of Hollywood's most magnetic icons. But very few understand that beneath that glamorous surface lived a man whose heart carried wounds that never fully healed. And those wounds were tied forever to his wife Jean, the woman who shared his golden years before life pulled them apart. After their deaths, something unexpected happened. As the years passed, fans and historians began looking deeper into Dean Martin's life, beyond the spotlight and stage lights. And the more people learned, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. Dean's happiest, most grounded, most peaceful years were the ones he spent with Jean. They were his anchor, his sanctuary, his real life, the life he lost long before his final breath. What made their ending so awful wasn't scandal, betrayal, or bitterness. It was the pain of 2 good people being slowly crushed by fame, exhaustion, and heartbreaking losses. They didn't fall out of love, they fell out of strength. And once their marriage dissolved, neither of them ever found the same joy, the same warmth, or the same sense of home again. Dean tried to fill the void with work, laughter, and friendships, but it all felt like echoes of a happier time. Jean tried to rebuild a quiet life, but the memories of her family and the tragedy of losing her son haunted her. Both lived on, but neither ever returned to who they once were. In the years after their passing, those close to them revealed something the public never knew. Dean still spoke about Jean with tenderness until the end. He kept old photographs. He asked about her. He never allowed anyone to disrespect her or reduce her importance in his story. And after he died, Jean kept her silence, a silence filled with love, regret, and memories that belonged only to them. Their story became a reminder that even the strongest stars are human. They shine brightly, but they break quietly. Dean Martin, the entertainer who made the world smile, spent his final years in loneliness, mourning the people he lost and the love he couldn't save. Jean, the woman who once held the center of his world, drifted through her last years in sorrow, carrying decades of memories that ended in heartbreak. And yet, their legacy is not just tragedy, that is also the story of a love that shaped a legend. Jean humanized Dean. She gave him family, stability, warmth, and the one life he could never recreate. Dean gave Jean a love that made her world larger, brighter, and deeply meaningful, even if the ending was painful. Their deaths left a hole in Hollywood's heart, not because they were famous, but because their story was real. Behind all the fame, they were just two people who loved each other deeply, lost each other painfully, and lived the rest of their lives in the shadow of what could have been. Today, when fans revisit Dean Martin's songs, films, and interviews, they often spot small moments, a smile, a glance, a tone of voice that hint at the man he was when Jean was still part of his world. Those moments feel like whispers from a life long gone. Their story remains one of Hollywood's quietest tragedies, the kind that doesn't make headlines but leaves a lasting ache in the hearts of those who learn it. Dean Martin and Jean didn't get the happy ending they deserved, but they will forever be remembered as two souls whose love shaped an entire era, even as it slowly broke their hearts.